Jedediah's hand shook as he uncovered the half-frozen woman in the snow, her body curled protectively around a tiny bundle that released a desperate cry. The infant's piercing blue eyes locked with his, shattering 3 years of crushing solitude and awakening a fierce purpose that no gold claim ever could. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Section 1/10. Under the merciless grip of an Alaskan winter. Jedediah Blackwood trudged through knee-deep snow, his weathered face barely visible beneath the frost-crusted beard that hung from his chin. The beam from his mining helmet cut a weak path through the approaching darkness as days surrendered to the long northern night. His shoulders, once broad and proud, now slumped under the weight of isolation and bitter cold. 30 months. That's how long he'd been up here chasing golden dreams in the unforgiving wilderness. 30 months of talking to rocks, to the walls of his cabin, to the stars that watched without answering. The gold was there enough to keep him going, but never enough to leave. And with each passing season, the silence grew louder until it became a presence that followed him like a shadow. The wind howled, slicing through his layers of wool and leather. A storm was brewing, worse than the one that had blown through 3 days prior. He needed to get back to his cabin, back to the meager warmth of his cast-iron stove, and the company of old books he'd read so many times he could recite them by heart. Just a little further, he muttered, his voice sounding strange and hollow in the vastness. His words formed clouds that were immediately torn away by the wind. That's when he saw it, a dark shape against the endless white, half buried in a drift at the base of a massive pine. At first he thought it might be a fallen deer, or perhaps a bear that hadn't made it to hibernation, but something about the shape made him pause. Something human. Jedediah's heart began to hammer against his ribs as he quickened his pace, boots crunching through the hardening crust of snow. Drawn closer, he saw the unmistakable curve of shoulders, the outline of a woman's form nearly covered by the steadily falling snow. "Hello?" he called out, already knowing there would be no answer. She wasn't moving. "Dear God," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, with pale skin turned blue at the lips and eyelids, dark hair spilled from beneath a woolen cap already frosted with ice crystals. Her coat was thin, far too thin for these mountains, and clutched to her chest was a bundle wrapped in what looked like a patchwork quilt. Jedediah touched her face, her skin cold as the snow around them, but then a miraculous soft groan escaped her lips. She was alive. "Hold on," he said, his voice urgent now as he brushed the snow from her limbs. "I've got you." As he shifted her, preparing to lift her, the bundle against her chest moved. A tiny whimper emerged from within the folds of the quilt. With trembling fingers, Jedediah pulled back the fabric and found himself staring into the face of an infant, no more than a few months old, eyes shut tight against the cold, cheeks flushed red where they pressed against the mother's body, the only warmth left to share. For a moment, Jedediah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. A child, out here, in this wilderness. How long had they been in the snow? How had they even gotten here? The infant whimpered again, louder this time, and the sound broke through his shock. With newfound strength, Jedediah gathered the woman in his arms, careful to keep the baby secure between them. She was lighter than he expected, as if the cold had hollowed her out. "Stay with me," he urged, rising to his feet with his precious burden. "Both of you stay with me." The cabin was a quarter-mile away, but it might as well have been 10 miles through the deepening snow and howling wind. Each step was a battle, his muscles screaming as he pushed forward. The woman didn't stir again, her head lolling against his shoulder, but the child continued to make small sounds as if urging him onward. By the time the cabin came into view, a small, solitary structure with smoke curling from the chimney, Jedediah's breath came in ragged gasps. The light from his mining helmet had dimmed, batteries weakened by the cold, but there was enough illumination from the cabin's windows to guide his final steps. He kicked open the door, the warmth inside hitting him like a physical force after the frigid journey. Without ceremony, he laid the woman on his narrow cot, still clutching the baby to her chest. "Get you warm," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. He stoked the fire in the stove, adding fresh logs until the flames roared. Then he turned his attention back to his unexpected guests. The woman's clothes were soaked through, her skin dangerously cold. The baby, protected somewhat by the mother's body in the quilt, seemed in better condition, but still far too cold. Jedediah knew enough about the wilderness to recognize hypothermia when he saw it. With careful movements, he unwrapped the quilt from around the baby, a little girl with wisps of dark hair and rounded cheeks. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, deep blue, like summer sky before closing again. He replaced the damp quilt with his own blankets, wrapping her securely. Then came the more difficult task. The woman needed dry clothes, needed warmth, but she was unconscious. Unable to help herself, Jedediah hesitated, his rough hands hovering over her coat buttons. "I'm sorry, miss," he said softly, proceeding with as much delicacy as his calloused fingers would allow. He replaced her wet garments with his spare shirts and trousers, oversized but dry. Her skin was pale as moonlight, marked with scratches and bruises that spoke of a difficult journey. Once she was changed, he tucked blankets around her, placed the baby in the crook of her arm, and pulled his single chair close to the bedside. Outside, the storm had arrived in full force. wind battering the cabin walls like some great beast trying to break in. Jedediah watched the rise and fall of the woman's chest. Slow but steady, the color was gradually returning to her face. The baby had fallen into a deeper sleep, tiny fingers curled against her mother's side. Who were they? How had they ended up near his isolated claim, miles from the nearest town or settlement? There were no roads, no paths a woman with a baby could have followed, especially in winter. As the hours stretched on and the storm raged outside, Jedediah found himself speaking to them, his voice rusty from disuse. "Been a while since I had visitors," he said, poking at the fire. "About 2 years since anyone came this far up. Not much out here except trees, mountains, and me. Oh, and the gold, of course. Not that there's much of that either lately." The woman stirred slightly, a small furrow appearing between her brows as if she could hear him through her unconsciousness. "You're safe now," he added quickly. "Storm's bad, but this cabin's solid. Built it myself. We'll wait it out, and when you're stronger, you can tell me how you got here." The baby made a soft, cooing sound in her sleep, and Jedediah felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been frozen for longer than he cared to remember. Outside his small window, darkness had swallowed everything. The snow fell in thick curtains, erasing trails, covering tracks. By morning, there would be no sign of the journey they had made to reach his door, as if they had materialized from the storm itself. Jedediah leaned back in his chair, keeping vigil as the night deepened. For the first time in 30 months, the silence of his cabin had been broken. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone with his fading dreams and the ghosts of his past. "Rest easy," he whispered. "You found shelter. You found me." And as the woman's breathing grew stronger and the baby sighed contentedly in her sleep, Jedediah Blackwood felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time, the faint, hesitant stirring of hope. Section 2/10 dawn arrived with reluctant light, gray and diffused through the frosted windows of Jedediah's cabin. The storm had spent itself sometime in the night, leaving behind a world transformed, deeper, quieter, more isolated than before. He had dozed in the chair, waking frequently to check on his guests and feed the hungry stove that kept death at bay. The woman had not stirred beyond the occasional murmur, her breathing steadier now but still shallow. The baby had woken twice, fussing softly until Jedediah had awkwardly offered a clean rag soaked in warmed condensed milk. It wasn't proper infant food, but it was the best he could manage from his meager supplies. As morning light filled the cabin, Jedediah studied the woman's face. Even in unconsciousness, there was a determination in the set of her jaw, a strength that had kept her alive when the wilderness demanded otherwise. Her dark hair had dried in the night's warmth, revealing streaks of chestnut that caught the firelight. The bruises along her temple and cheek looked worse in daylight purple against alabaster skin. He was washing his few dishes when he heard it, a change in breathing, a rustling of blankets. Turning, he saw the woman's eyes flutter open. They were green, startling against her pale face and filled immediately with confusion, then fear. She jerked upright, hands frantically searching the blankets beside her. "My baby!" The words were hoarse, barely above a whisper. "She's right here," Jedediah said quickly, gesturing to the wooden crate he'd padded with blankets where the infant slept soundly. "She's all right. You both are." The woman's eyes darted between him and the makeshift cradle, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. "Who are you? Where am I?" "Name's Jedediah Blackwood. This is my cabin." He kept his distance, recognizing the wild look in her eyes. "Found you both in the snow yesterday, about half a mile east of here. Brought you back before the storm took." Some of the tension left her shoulders, but wariness remained in her gaze. She tried to stand, only to sink back onto the cot, her strength not yet returned. "Easy now," Jedediah cautioned. "You were near frozen through. Body needs time." She looked down at herself, registering the oversized clothes that had replaced her own. A flash of vulnerability crossed her face, quickly replaced by resolve. "I had to ... Your clothes were soaked. Didn't look more than necessary," he explained awkwardly, a flush creeping up his neck. "Your things are drying by the stove." The woman nodded slowly, accepting the necessity. "Thank you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "For saving us," Jedediah nodded, relieved. "Coffee? It's not much, but it's hot. Please." She glanced again at the sleeping baby, then back to him. "My name is Elizabeth Caldwell, and that's Sarah, my daughter." Jedediah poured coffee into his second-best mug and brought it to her. Their fingers brushed as she accepted it, and he noticed how delicate her hands were, despite the calluses that spoke of hard work. "What brought you out here, Mrs. Caldwell?" "Nearest town's Fort Amity, and that's 15 miles south. No place for a woman and child, especially in winter." Elizabeth's eyes flickered, something guarded passing across her features. "It's Miss," she corrected softly. "And we were traveling. Got separated from our guide 3 days back." She sipped the coffee, her hands trembling slightly. The storm came faster than expected. Jedediah sensed there was much more that she wasn't saying, but he didn't press. Out here, folks had their reasons for seeking isolation, for running from civilization. He understood that better than most. "Well, you're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel," he offered, "though I'd advise waiting until spring. Winter up here's no joke, as you've seen, especially not with a little one." Elizabeth looked around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the stacks of mining equipment, the solitary existence evident in every corner. "You're alone out here?" Going on 3 years now? He moved to stoke the fire, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. Came up to stake a claim after the rush died down. Figured there'd be less competition. And was there? Gold, I mean. Jedediah smiled ruefully. Some. Enough to keep me digging, not enough to make me rich. He paused, memories surfacing. Had a partner once, first year up, Marcus. Good man. Fever took him winter of '87. Elizabeth's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry. Losing someone, ... It marks you. That it does. He cleared his throat, unwilling to dwell on old sorrows. How old is she? Your girl. 4 months next week. Pride warmed Elizabeth's voice. Born in August under the Perseids. My shooting star. As if hearing her mother's voice, the baby stirred, tiny fists waving. Elizabeth's attention immediately shifted, her entire being focused on her child. Jedediah watched as she gathered Sarah into her arms, murmuring soft words of comfort. There was a grace to her movements, a tender confidence that made his chest ache with something he couldn't name. It had been so long since he'd witnessed such simple human connections. She'll be hungry, Elizabeth said, glancing up. Did she eat during the night? Jedediah nodded. Gave her some milk. Not proper, I know, but you did fine, she assured him. But I can feed her now. Understanding her meaning, Jedediah turned away, busying himself with unnecessary tasks while Elizabeth nursed her child. The soft sounds of mother and baby filled the cabin, turning the rough-hewn shelter into something that almost resembled a home. When she finished, Elizabeth cleared her throat gently. Safe to look now, Mr. Blackwood. He turned, finding her cradling Sarah against her shoulder, patting the infant's back with practiced ease. Just Jedediah is fine. Or Jed. Don't get much use for formalities up here. Jedediah, she repeated, testing the name. Biblical. Beloved of the Lord. He shrugged. Mother was devoted. Father less so. He hesitated, then asked the question that had troubled him through the night. Your guide... Will they be looking for you? Elizabeth's expression shuddered. No, I expect not. And there's no one else? No one waiting for you to arrive somewhere? Her silence was answer enough. Outside, the sun had risen fully now, reflecting blindingly off the new snow. Jedediah moved to the window, considering what needed doing. The animals would need tending. He kept a few chickens and 2 goats in a small lean-to attached to the cabin. Wood needed chopping. His own breakfast needed cooking. I should warn you, he said finally. I'm not much for conversation. Been alone too long, I suppose. Words don't come easy. Elizabeth adjusted Sarah in her arms. Silence doesn't frighten me. Quite the opposite. Something in her tone made him turn back to her. There was a story there, one written in the careful way she held herself, in the vigilant glances toward the door, in the bruises that weren't just from cold and exhaustion. Well, he said, reaching for his coat, I've got chores. You rest. There's food in that cupboard if you get hungry. Not fancy, but it fills the belly. As he moved to the door, Elizabeth called softly, Jedediah? He paused, hand on the latch. Why did you do it? Bring us in. He wouldn't have bothered. The question struck him oddly. That anyone would consider leaving a woman and child to die in the snow seemed incomprehensible. But then, he'd seen enough of mankind's darker nature to know better. Couldn't leave you, he said simply. Wouldn't have been human. Outside, the cold air hit his lungs like a blow. The world was pristine, unmarked, a blank canvas of white stretching to the tree line. Jedediah took a deep breath, his thoughts churning. Who was Elizabeth Caldwell? What had driven her to these mountains with an infant in the dead of winter? And what would her presence mean for the solitary life he'd carved from this unforgiving land? The questions followed him as he trudged through snow toward the lean-to. Behind him, through the cabin window, he could see Elizabeth moving carefully around his small table, the baby nestled in one arm. The sight was so foreign, so unexpected that he paused to watch for him. For nearly 3 years, he'd come and gone from that cabin without another soul to mark his past. Now, suddenly, there was life inside those walls, a woman with secrets in her eyes and a child with a future yet unwritten. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jedediah felt the weight of responsibility for something more precious than gold. Section 3/10 days slipped by like beads on a string, each one bringing subtle shifts to the rhythm of Jedediah's solitary existence. Elizabeth regained her strength gradually, moving from the cot to helping with small tasks around the cabin. Her hands, though smaller than his, worked with quiet efficiency, mending tears in his clothing he hadn't bothered to fix, organizing his haphazard shelves, bringing order to chaos he hadn't realized existed. Little Sarah thrived in the cabin's warmth, her cheeks filling out, eyes growing more alert. Jedediah found himself watching her tiny expressions with fascination, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, how her mouth quirked in what might someday be a smile. He'd fashioned a proper cradle from an old trunk lined with the softest fabrics he could find, and Elizabeth had thanked him with shining eyes that made him turn away, uncomfortable with gratitude he felt he hadn't earned. A week after their arrival, he returned from checking his traps to find Elizabeth at his small table, a leather-bound journal open before her. She closed it quickly when he entered, but not before he glimpsed pages covered in neat, flowing script. Found that in the bundle you were carrying, he explained, hanging his coat by the door. Figured it was yours. Didn't read it. Elizabeth nodded, her fingers lingering protectively on the worn cover. It was my mother's then mine, a record of ... things I don't want forgotten. Jedediah set his catch 2 snowshoe hairs on the counter. Records are important, especially out here where days blur together. Do you keep one? A journal? He shook his head. Never saw much point. Nobody to read it after I'm gone. Elizabeth's gaze was steady, assessing. Perhaps that's exactly why one should write, to leave proof that you existed, that your thoughts mattered. Something in her words struck him, a truth he'd been avoiding in his isolation. What trace would remain of Jedediah Blackwood once the wilderness reclaimed his bones? Would anyone remember the man who had chased golden dreams into these mountains? Maybe, he conceded, then gestured to the hares. Dinner. She rose to help him, and they worked side by side in companionable silence. Elizabeth's movements were precise, economical, the motions of someone accustomed to making do with little. As she chopped the few wild onions he'd managed to preserve, Jedediah noticed a scar on her wrist, partially hidden by his too large shirt sleeve, a thin, deliberate line that spoke of something other than accident. He didn't ask. Out here, scars, both visible and hidden, were as common as calluses. That night, after a meal that tasted better than anything he'd managed alone, they sat before the fire. Sarah slept in her cradle, one tiny fist pressed against her cheek. The wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters, but inside was warm, almost cozy. "Tell me about the gold," Elizabeth said, breaking the silence. "What made you come all this way to find it?" Jedediah stared into the flames, considering. Few had asked him that question. Most miners didn't need to articulate the fever that drove them to forsake comfort for the promise of riches. "Started after the war," he said finally. "Nothing left for me back east. Parents gone, farms sold to pay debts. Figured I'd try my luck where a man could still claim something of his own." "The war," Elizabeth echoed. "You fought?" He nodded, the memories rising unbidden. "Union, 4 years, that felt like 40. Saw things, ... Single quotes he trailed off, then shrugged. "After that, the isolation up here didn't seem so bad." Elizabeth's face softened with understanding. "And the gold? Did you find what you were looking for?" A rueful smile crossed his weathered face. "Found enough to keep going. That's all any of us really get, I suppose." He glanced at her. "What about you? What drove you into these mountains with a baby in winter?" Elizabeth tensed, her fingers twisting in her lap. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, that the wall behind her eyes would remain firmly in place. But then she sighed, the sound of surrender. "I was running," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Still am, I suppose." Jedediah waited, knowing some stories needed space to unfold. "Sarah's father," she continued, eyes fixed on the flames, "is a powerful man in Denver, Charles Rutherford. Perhaps you've heard of him?" Jedediah shook his head. News traveled slowly to his isolated claim, if at all. "He owns half the banks in Colorado, or so they say. Has the governor's ear and judges in his pocket." Her voice had turned bitter. "I worked in his household as a companion to his sister. When she died of consumption last year, I stayed on as his secretary. He was ... attentive, charming when he wanted to." She paused, gathering herself. "I was foolish enough to believe his promises. By the time I realized my mistake, I was already carrying Sarah." Her hand drifted to the sleeping infant, protective. "When I told him, everything changed. He has a wife, you see. Estranged, living in Boston, but still legally his wife." Jedediah's jaw tightened, already seeing where this tale led. "He offered money for ... a solution. When I refused, he became different." The charm vanished. Her fingers unconsciously traced the scar on her wrist. "He kept me a virtual prisoner in his house until Sarah was born, telling everyone I was his poor, disturbed cousin who needed careful watching. And after she was born?" Elizabeth's eyes darkened. "He took one look at her and saw only a problem to solve. I overheard him instructing his man Fletcher to take us somewhere remote and return alone." Her voice broke slightly. "I fled that night with what little I could carry. Been moving north ever since, taking odd jobs, staying ahead of his men." "Fletcher," Jedediah repeated. "Your guide?" She nodded. "He caught up to me in Fort Amity. Pretended to be a sympathetic stranger offering safe passage through the mountains. I didn't recognize him at first, had only heard his voice through doors. By the time I did ... She gestured to the bruises on her face, now fading to yellow. "He meant to fulfill his orders during the storm when no one would question 2 more souls lost to winter. But you got away. Struck him with a rock when he was tending the fire. Took his horse and rode until the animal couldn't go further." Her eyes met Jedediah's, burst with maternal determination. "I'd rather have died in the snow with Sarah than let him take her from me." The cabin fell silent save for the popping of the fire and the soft breaths of the sleeping infant. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the woman's tale. "He won't stop looking," Elizabeth whispered finally. "Men like Charles Rutherford don't allow anyone to defy them, especially not women they consider their property." Jedediah stared into the fire, digesting her story. He'd seen men like Rutherford during and after the war, who confused wealth with worth, who believed money entitled them to whatever and whoever they desired. "Spring won't come for months yet," he said slowly. "Passes are snowed in. Even if this Fletcher survived, he won't make it back with reinforcements until the thaw." Elizabeth looked at him, a question in her eyes. "What I mean is," Jedediah continued, "you're safe here, both of you, for now at least. And when spring comes?" There was a vulnerability in her question that belied her earlier strength. Jedediah had no answer that wouldn't sound like empty promises. Instead, he rose and added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap higher. "We'll figure that out when we need to," he said finally. "One day at a time is how we survive up here." Later that night, after Elizabeth had retired to the cot with Sarah nestled beside her, Jedediah sat alone by the dying fire. Sleep eluded him, his thoughts circling around the woman and child who had stumbled into his life like a dream he hadn't realized he'd been having. For nearly 3 years, he'd lived without human connection, convincing himself that solitude was preference rather than punishment. Now, with their presence filling the hollow spaces of his existence, he could no longer maintain that fiction. Outside, the moon had risen, casting silver light across the endless snow. Somewhere out there, a man lay dead or wounded, and others would come searching when he failed to return. Men with guns and money and the certainty that comes from never being denied. Jedediah's hand drifted to the rifle propped by the door. He'd left violence behind after the war, had come to these mountains to escape the memory of what men could do to one another in the name of righteousness or greed. But for the woman and child sleeping peacefully across the room, for the chance at redemption they unknowingly offered, he would remember how to fight, how to protect what mattered. And for the first time in years, something did matter. Someone did. Section 4/10 January deepened, wrapping the mountains in layers of silence and snow. The routine of cabin life expanded to include Elizabeth and Sarah, their presence transforming mundane tasks into something approaching contentment. Mornings began with Jedediah stoking the fire before dawn, the cabin still dark as he moved about with the ease of long habit. Elizabeth would wake soon after, attending to Sarah's needs with whispered endearments that drifted through the cabin like music. They learned to navigate the confined space without collision, a careful dance of deference and necessity. Elizabeth insisted on earning her keep, taking over the cooking and mending while Jedediah tended to the heavier work chopping wood, clearing snow from the doorway, checking his traps and fishing lines for their dinner. Sarah became the center of their shared orbit, her developments marked with mutual wonder. Her first genuine smile, toothless, dimpled marvel, drew a rare laugh from Jedediah, the sound so unfamiliar to his own ears that he'd fallen silent afterward, startled by his reaction. "It suits you," Elizabeth had said softly. Laughter. Jedediah had merely nodded, unable to explain how foreign such simple joy had become. One evening, as heavy snow fell outside, Elizabeth sat cross-legged before the fire, Sarah asleep in her cradle nearby. She was mending one of Jedediah's shirts, her nimble fingers working the needle with practiced ease. "You never said where you learned that," Jedediah remarked, watching from his chair where he was whittling a small wooden toy bear for Sarah. "The sewing," Elizabeth's hands stilled momentarily. "My mother taught me. She was a seamstress for wealthy families in Philadelphia before she married." A small smile touched her lips. She could create something beautiful from scraps most would discard. Like her daughter, Jedediah observed quietly. Her eyes lifted to his, surprise and something warmer flickering in their depths. "I've never thought of it that way." "Well, you should." He returned to his carving, embarrassed by his boldness. "Seems to me you've made something fine from difficult circumstances." Elizabeth considered this, then resumed her stitching. "Perhaps. Though I didn't do it alone," her voice soft. "Sometimes salvation comes from unexpected quarters." The words hung between them, fragile and significant. Jedediah's knife paused mid-stroke. "I'm no one's salvation," he said finally, the statement rough with conviction. "Just a man who did what needed doing. Isn't that the very definition?" Elizabeth challenged gently. "Doing what's needed when others wouldn't?" Before he could answer, a howl pierced the night close, hungry, wild. Sarah stirred in her sleep and Elizabeth tensed, her hand automatically reaching toward the cradle. "Wolves," Jedediah explained, setting aside his carving. "They come closer when game gets scarce." He moved to the window, peering through frosted glass at the darkness beyond. "Pack sounds bigger this year." Elizabeth joined him, keeping a careful distance that he'd come to recognize as deliberate, a boundary maintained not from fear of him, but from fear of dependence. "Are they dangerous to us?" "Not usually. Cabin's solid, animals secure." He glanced at her worried expression. "But I'll reinforce the lean-to tomorrow just to be certain." Another howl echoed, answered by several more. Sarah whimpered in her sleep, tiny fists clenching. Elizabeth went to her, soothing her with a gentle touch. "She seems to know," Elizabeth murmured. "Even in sleep, she senses the danger." Jedediah watched them, struck by the fierce protectiveness in Elizabeth's posture. "Children know more than we credit them for," he said. "My sister's boy was the same way. Could feel a storm coming before the clouds showed themselves." Elizabeth looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "You have family?" "You never mentioned them." Jedediah returned to his chair, picking up the wooden bear and turning it in his hand. "Had," he corrected. "Sister died of fever 6 years back. Her husband 2 years before that, and your nephew went to his father's people in Kansas." The knife bit into the wood again, shaping an ear with careful precision. "Better for him there. Farms, schools, a future. Nothing I could offer." Elizabeth studied him, seeing past the gruff exterior to the regret beneath. "You miss him." It wasn't a question, but Jedediah nodded anyway. "Thomas. He'd be 12 now. Sending him away was right, but single quotes," he trailed off, then shrugged. "Makes no matter. Done is done." Elizabeth returned to her sewing, but her eyes remained thoughtful. "Is that why you came here after your sister died?" "Partly." Jedediah tested the edge of the bear's muzzle with his thumb. "War left me restless. Couldn't settle back into ordinary life. Thought I needed fortune to make something of myself, to have something worth offering." His laugh was short, self-deprecating. "Gold fever, they call it. The delusion that wealth waits just beyond the next ridge." "And does it wait for you?" He looked around the cabin at the rough-hewn furniture, The patched roof, the modest pile of supplies that stood between them and starvation, found enough to survive, not enough to change anything that matters. Elizabeth was silent for a moment, her needle flashing in the firelight. Perhaps what matters changes when you stop looking for gold. The wolves howled again. Closer now, their cries twining together in primordial hunger. Sarah stirred but didn't wake. Jedediah rose to add another log to the fire, the familiar motion grounding him. "You never said where you were headed," he remarked, before your guide showed his true colors. Elizabeth knotted her thread, then snipped it with small scissors. "North," she said simply. "Canada. Eventually. I have a distant cousin in Vancouver who might help us start fresh. Somewhere Rutherford's influence doesn't reach. Long journey, the longest." She folded the mended shirt, her movements precise, but necessary. "For Sarah's sake, if not my own." Jedediah nodded, understanding the weight of her resolve. "Well, you'll need proper supplies when spring comes. Better clothing for both of you. Map of the northern passes." Elizabeth looked at him, a question in her eye. "You'd help us continue our journey?" "Said I would, didn't I?" He focused on his carving, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "Besides, can't keep you here forever. The cabin's too small and I've got mining to do come thaw." If she was hurt by his gruff response, Elizabeth didn't show it. She merely nodded, her gaze returning to her sleeping daughter. "Yes, of course." The evening stretched on in companionable silence, broken only by the scratch of Jedediah's knife against wood and the occasional crackle of the fire. Outside, the wolf pack moved on, their howls fading into the vastness of the mountain night. Later, as Elizabeth prepared for sleep, Sarah already nestled in the crook of her arm. She paused. "Jedediah?" He looked up from where he sat, still working on the wooden bear by firelight. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for saving us that day, but for everything since." The sincerity in her voice made something twist in his chest. "Get some rest," he replied, unable to find words for what he truly felt. Morning comes early up here. As January gave way to February, the cold intensified, turning breath to frost and freezing the creek solid enough to walk across. Jedediah's trips to check his traps grew more arduous, the snow sometimes reaching his thighs as he pushed through drifts. But he never returned empty-handed, determined that neither Elizabeth nor Sarah would know hunger under his roof. Elizabeth, for her part, transformed the Spartan cabin with small touches: a curtain fashioned from an old flour sack to separate sleeping areas, a broom made from bound twigs to keep the floor clean, shelves reorganized for efficiency. She even uncovered Jedediah's neglected fiddle from beneath his cot, dusting it carefully and placing it near the fire. "Do you play?" she asked when she caught him looking at it one evening. "Used to," he admitted. "Not for years now. Sarah would love it, I think," Elizabeth suggested gently. "Babies respond. It helps them grow." Jedediah eyed the instrument with a mixture of longing and reluctance. Fingers are stiffer than they were. "Wouldn't sound like much." "Try," she encouraged. "Please." And so, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, music returned to the cabin. Simple tunes remembered from his youth folk songs, hymns, marching melodies stripped of their martial associations. Sarah watched with fascination, her blue eyes tracking his movements, tiny body swaying instinctively to the rhythm. The fiddle became part of their evening, a ritual that marked the transition from day's labor to night's rest. Sometimes Elizabeth would hum along, her voice soft but true, occasionally offering lyrics to songs they both knew. In those moments, the cabin seemed to expand beyond its physical constraints, becoming something neither had dared name but both had begun to feel home. Section 5/10. Mid-February brought a stretch of clear, bitter days when the cold seemed alive, a predator stalking the mountains, seeking entry through every crack and crevice. The skies remained a merciless blue, the sun offering light without warmth as temperatures plunged to depths that made the trees crack like gunshots in the night. Jedediah woke before dawn, as always, to find frost patterns etched across the inside of the windows despite the fire he'd maintained throughout the night. The cabin's interior had never felt so cold, not even during his first winter alone when he'd still been learning the ways of survival in this unforgiving land. Elizabeth and Sarah still slept, huddled together beneath every available blanket, their breath forming small clouds above the bedding. Sarah's face was barely visible, just a tiny pink nose and closed eyelids peeking out from her mother's protective embrace. Moving silently, Jedediah stoked the fire, adding precious logs from his dwindling supply. The brutal cold had forced him to burn through wood faster than anticipated. If the freeze continued, he'd need to venture further into the forest for more, a dangerous prospect in these conditions. As flames rose higher, chasing shadows into corners, Jedediah pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around the lower half of his face. He needed to check the animals before breakfast. The chickens and goats would be suffering in the lean-to despite the extra hay he'd packed around them. The door protested as he forced it open, ice sealing its edges. Outside, the world was transformed into something alien and hostile. Familiar landmarks, rendered strange beneath crystalline layers. The air so cold it burned his lungs with each breath. Moving carefully down the 3 snow-packed steps, he made his way toward the lean-to, each footfall crunching through ice crust into powder beneath. The animals greeted him with pitiful sound, their breath forming thick clouds in the confined space. The water trough had frozen solid despite the lantern he'd left burning, and the goats pressed close to him, seeking warmth. Jedediah worked quickly, breaking ice, refilling troughs, spreading fresh hay. His fingers grew numb despite his gloves, and his face stung where skin remained exposed. By the time he returned to the cabin, Elizabeth was awake, Sarah nursing at her breast, both still wrapped in blankets near the fire. "It's worse today," she observed, noting the pallor of his face, the stiffness in his movements as he removed his outer garments. Jedediah nodded, rubbing life back into his hands. "Never seen it this cold, not even that first winter." He glanced toward the wood stack, concern furrowing his brow. "We'll need to be careful with the fire. Wood's running lower than I'd like." Elizabeth's gaze followed his. "Could we burn something else? Furniture, perhaps, if it comes to that." He moved to the stove, where coffee percolated slowly. "Got some deadfall marked about a mile north. I'll try for it later today if the wind doesn't pick up." "Alone?" There was worry in her voice, worry he'd grown unaccustomed to hearing directed at him. "No choice. Wood won't fetch itself." He poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, bringing one to her. Their fingers brushed as she accepted it, and he noticed how smooth her skin had become in the weeks since her arrival, no longer chapped and raw from exposure, though still marked by old scars and new calluses. Sarah finished nursing, and Elizabeth adjusted her clothing before shifting the baby to her shoulder, patting gently. The domestic intimacy of the gesture still struck Jedediah as miraculous in its ordinariness, this evidence of life continuing, of human bonds persisting, despite the wilderness that pressed in from all sides. "I could come with you," Elizabeth offered, surprising, to gather wood. Sarah would be warm enough, bundled up for a short while. Jedediah shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. Trails steep in parts, hidden under snow. One wrong step, ... He didn't need to finish the thought. "I'm stronger than I look," she persisted, "and 4 hands are better than 2 for carry." "It's not about strength," he countered, sipping his coffee. "It's about knowing the land, where ice hides beneath snow, where drifts can swallow a person whole. Took me months to learn these mountains, and I still get surprised sometimes." Elizabeth fell silent, acknowledging the wisdom in his words. Sarah gurgled against her shoulder, oblivious to the concerns of adults. "We'll manage," Jedediah assured her. Gentler now, always have, but the day proved more challenging than anticipated. By noon, the wind had risen, driving fine, crystalline snow into every exposed surface. Jedediah delayed his wood-gathering expedition, unwilling to risk disorientation in what was quickly becoming whiteout conditions. Instead, he focused on reinforcing the cabin's defenses against the cold, stuffing rags into cracks, hanging extra hides over windows, even dismantling a seldom-used shelf to burn when evening came. As darkness fell, earlier than seemed natural, the temperature inside the cabin dropped, despite their efforts. Sarah grew fussy, her usual contentment replaced by whimpers that escalated to cries no matter how Elizabeth rocked and soothed her. "She's cold," Elizabeth worried, pressing a palm to the baby's cheek. Her hands, too, despite the wrapping. Jedediah knelt beside them, concern etching deeper lines in his weather-worn face. The infant's cries tore at something primal within him, an instinct to protect that had lain dormant for too long. "The cot's too far from the fire," he observed, "and too exposed to drafts from that corner." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes reflecting firelight and fear. "What do we do? She can't stay warm enough." Jedediah considered their options, limited as they were. Then, reaching a decision, he began rearranging the cabin's sparse furnishings, pushing his chair against the wall, dragging the small table aside. From beneath his cot, he pulled out an old buffalo hide, a relic from his early days of hunting that he'd kept more from sentimentality than practical need. "We'll make a nest," he explained, laying the hide on the floor directly before the fire, like wolves do in winter. Shared warmth. Understanding dawned in Elizabeth's eyes. Without hesitation, she brought blankets from the cot, arranging them atop the buffalo hide in layers. Jedediah added his bedroll and a deerskin he'd been saving to trade come spring. When the makeshift bed was complete, Elizabeth settled onto it with Sarah, who continued to cry softly, her tiny body shivering despite being wrapped in wool. Jedediah hovered uncertainly at the edge of their circle of firelight. "I'll keep the fire stoked through the night," he offered, not quite meeting her eyes. Elizabeth looked up at him, her face solemn in the dancing light. "That won't be enough," she said quietly. "We need your warmth too." The invitation, for that was what it was, practical necessity notwithstanding, hung between them, weighty with implications neither was prepared to voice. Jedediah remained frozen, torn between what was proper and what was needed. Sarah's cries intensified, her distress breaking through his hesitation. "Please," Elizabeth said simply. For her dots single quotes with careful movements, Jedediah lowered himself onto the makeshift bed, positioning his body on the far side of the buffalo hide, maintaining a respectful distance. Elizabeth adjusted Sarah between them, the baby's cries already beginning to subside as she absorbed their combined warmth. Gradually the 3 of them settled, bodies aligned but not quite touching, the fire crackling nearby, wind howling beyond the walls. Sarah's breathing deepened as she drifted into sleep, one tiny hand curled against Jedediah's rough shirt where it had found its way during her restless movements. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered, her eyes meeting his across the small distance that separated them. Jedediah nodded, unable to voice the emotions that constricted his throat. This arrangement, this family-like closeness, was so far removed from his solitary existence that it felt like something from another life, a dream he might wake from at any moment. Yet as the night deepened and the cold pressed harder against the cabin walls, something shifted imperceptibly. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or the primal need for warmth, or simply the natural gravitation of bodies seeking comfort, but the careful space between them narrowed. Elizabeth's head came to rest near his shoulder, her breathing synchronizing with his own. Sarah slept peacefully between them, secure in the fortress of their bodies. Outside, the wind screamed like a wounded thing, rattling shutters and scouring the mountainside clean of tracks or signs of human passage. But inside, in their circle of hard-won warmth, a different kind of storm was brewing, one made of unspoken words, of possibilities never before considered, of futures that suddenly seemed less impossible than they had in the cold light of day. And as Jedediah drifted towards sleep, the woman and child beside him more familiar now than solitude, he realized with a clarity that startled him fully awake. The gold he'd spent years searching for had found him instead, in a form he'd never thought to seek. Section 6/10. The brutal cold relented 3 days later, retreating like a predator temporarily sated. Temperatures rose enough that breath no longer froze instantly, and the constant cracking of frost-stressed trees subsided to occasional reports in the night. Jedediah seized the opportunity, venturing out at first light to gather the deadfall he'd marked before the cold snap descended. "I'll be back before midday," he promised Elizabeth as he secured his snowshoe, an axe strapped to his back, and a coil of rope at his belt. "Keep the fire steady but not too hungry." She nodded. Sarah balanced on her hip, the baby watching his preparations with solemn eyes that seemed to understand more than her few months should allow. "Be careful," Elizabeth said softly. "The mountain doesn't forgive carelessness." Jedediah paused at her words, struck by their echo of lessons he'd learned at painful cost. "You sound like you were born to this life," he observed. A small smile touched her lips. "Perhaps in another life I was." Outside, the world gleamed beneath a sun that finally carried a hint of warmth. Jedediah moved steadily through the snow, following landmarks only he would recognize: a lightning-split pine, a boulder shaped like a crouching bear, the subtle ridge where summer wildflowers would eventually emerge from winter's grip. The deadfall was where he remembered. 3 massive pines felled during an autumn storm, their weathered trunks partially buried by successive snowfalls. He worked methodically, clearing snow, sectioning log, creating a pile to haul back on the simple sled he'd constructed from scraps. As his axe bit into wood, his thoughts drifted back to the cabin, to the makeshift bed before the fire that they'd continued to share even after the worst of the cold had passed, to the unspoken comfort of human proximity after years of isolation, to Sarah's tiny hand curled trustingly against his chest each night. He had not intended this, had not sought companionship when he trudged through snow to investigate a dark shape against white, had not imagined that rescuing a half-frozen woman would reshape the contours of his existence so thoroughly that returning to solitude now seemed inconceivable. Yet here he was, cutting wood with renewed purpose, his mind filled not with gold but with the image of green eyes watching him across firelight, of small sounds of contentment from a child who had begun to recognize him, to smile when he entered a room. By the time he returned to the cabin, dragging the loaded sled behind him, the sun had climbed to its zenith. Smoke curled reassuringly from the chimney, and the sight of it of home caused a tightness in his chest that was not entirely uncomfortable. Elizabeth met him at the door, relief evident in her expression. "You're back," she said, as if his return had not been certain despite his promise that I would be. He stomped snow from his boots before entering, the warmth of the cabin enveloping him like an embrace. Sarah lay on her stomach atop the buffalo hide, attempting to lift her head, a determined gurgle escaping her as she spotted Jedediah. The sound, so clearly one of recognition, of welcome, pierced him more effectively than any bullet ever had. "She missed you," Elizabeth said, watching his reaction, kept looking toward the door. Jedediah removed his coat, unable to form words around the swell of emotion in his throat. Instead, he knelt beside the baby, offering a calloused finger that she immediately grasped, her grip surprisingly strong. "Hello, little one," he managed finally, his voice rough with feelings he'd thought long forgotten. "Keeping your mama company while I was gone." Sarah answered with a coo that might have been agreement, her blue eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that adults often lost, seeing with perfect clarity, without the filters of experience or expectation. "There's stew," Elizabeth offered, moving toward the stove, "and I found more coffee beans in that sack under your cot. Made a fresh pot." Jedediah looked up, suddenly aware of the domestic scene they presented, the woman preparing food, the man returned from labor, the child between them, a family tableau that he had never expected to participate in again, if ever. "Thank you," he said, the words encompassing far more than stew or coffee. As they ate their simple meal, Jedediah described the wood he'd gathered, the tracks he'd seen, rabbit, fox, even a moose that had passed within a quarter-mile of the cabin. "Game's moving again," he explained. "Good sign. Means the worst of winter's breaking." He paused, weighing his next words. "Won't be long before the first thaw begins." Elizabeth's spoon hesitated briefly before continuing its journey. "How long do you think?" "Late March, usually. Snow stays in shadows till May, but passes start clearing by April most years." He watched her face carefully. "Still a good stretch of winter left, though." She nodded, her her expression unreadable. Yes, of course. That afternoon, while Jedediah stacked wood against the cabin's exterior wall, Elizabeth explored the small storage chest he'd told her she was welcome to search for anything she might need. Most of its contents were practical extra socks, a spare knife, fishing line, a battered tin cup. But beneath these, wrapped in an oilcloth, she discovered a small bundle of letters, yellowed with age, tied with faded ribbon. She would not have opened them, respecting his privacy, had the top envelope not been partially unsealed, revealing a child's drawing. A stick figure with an oversized hat holding what appeared to be a mining pan, a bright yellow sun overhead. Found those, did you? Jedediah's voice from the doorway startled her. He stood with an armload of wood, his expression not angry, merely resigned. I'm sorry, she said quickly, replacing the bundle. I wasn't prying, never said you couldn't look. He deposited the wood near the stove, then moved to the chest, lifting out the letters. Thomas's drawing. Sends one with each letter, his grandmother writes. A faint smile crossed his face. Boy's got talent, unlike his uncle. Elizabeth watched as he carefully unfolded one of the papers, revealing a more recent drawing. A house, a horse, a field of what might be wheat. You said he was in Kansas, she ventured. Jedediah nodded. My late sister's mother-in-law took him in. Good woman. Strict but fair. He traced the childish lines with a gentle finger. She writes every few months. Sends these along so I don't forget his face as he grows. Do you reply? A shadow crossed his features. Sometime. Words don't come easy, especially the ones that matter. Elizabeth approached slowly, drawn by the rare vulnerability in his expression. May I? She asked, gesturing to the letters. After a moment's hesitation, Jedediah handed them to her, his movements suggesting both trust and trepidation. The letters were simple accounts of a boy's growth school achievements, minor illnesses overcome, inches gained in height. What struck Elizabeth most was the consistent postscript in a shaky hand that must belong to the grandmother. Thomas asks about you, tells everyone his uncle mines gold in Alaska. He remembers you, she said softly, returning the letters. Values your connection. Jedediah refolded the papers carefully. Remembers an idea of me. A few weeks together after his mother died, hardly enough to form a true picture. Children see more clearly than adults sometimes, Elizabeth countered. Sarah already knows you, though she has no words for it yet. Their eyes met across the small space, the air between them charged with unspoken meanings. Jedediah was the first to look away, returning the letters to their hiding place. Why did you never go back? She asked, the question that had been forming since she'd discovered the correspondent. To see him? Jedediah's shoulders tensed. Told myself I needed fortune first. Something to offer besides stories. He closed the chest with deliberate care. Truth is, I was afraid, still am, of what? Disappointing him, being less than he remembers. Less than he needs. Single quotes. He straightened, facing her with raw honesty. Some men aren't meant for family, Elizabeth. War taught me that. Take something you can't get back. She stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head to maintain eye contact. And yet here you are, caring for a woman and child not your own, risking yourself to keep us safe. Her voice softened. If that's not family, what is? Jedediah had no answer, his defenses eroded by her proximity, by the truth in her words that contradicted years of self-imposed exile from human connections. Sarah's cry from her makeshift cradle broke the moment. Elizabeth moved away to tend to her, leaving Jedediah with thoughts too complex to untangle, feelings too powerful to name. That night, as they settled onto their shared bed before the fire, Sarah already asleep between them, Elizabeth spoke into the comfortable silence. When spring comes, she said hesitantly, and the pass is clear. Single quotes. Jedediah waited, his breath caught somewhere between fear and hope. Perhaps we could reconsider our options, she finished, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. All of them. He turned to face her, searching her expression in the dancing light. All of them, he echoed, a question hidden within the repetition. Elizabeth nodded, her hand finding his across the small space that separated them. Life offers few second chances, Jedediah Blackwood. I've learned to recognize them when they appear, their fingers intertwined atop the buffalo hide, a bridge across history and circumstance, across wounds visible and hidden. Outside, stars pierce the night sky with cold fire, indifferent to human concerns, to the tentative bloom of possibility unfolding in a remote cabin beneath their ancient light. Section 7. Tense March arrived with deceptive gentlenesses growing noticeably longer, the sun's path climbing higher in the sky, its warmth beginning to assert itself against winter's stubborn grip. Though snow still blanketed the landscape, subtle changes announced the coming thaw, sickles dripping during daylight hours, patches of earth appearing on south-facing slopes, a return of birdsong in the morning. Inside the cabin, life had settled into patterns both comfortable and precarious. The physical boundaries between Jedediah and Elizabeth had gradually dissolved, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of their growing dependence on one another. Their shared bed before the fire had become permanent. Sarah nestled between them each night, their hands often finding each other in sleep, yet neither had put words to the feelings that had taken root during the long winter months, as if naming what grew between them might somehow destroy its fragile beauty, or invite the complications of the world beyond their sheltered altered existence. Sarah flourished under their combined care, her development marked by daily miracles, the strengthening of her neck muscles as she learned to hold her head steady, her increasing vocalization, the way her eyes tracked movement with growing precision. At nearly 6 months old, she had begun reaching deliberately for objects, her tiny fingers grasping at Jedediah's beard with fascination whenever he held her. "She has your determination," he observed one afternoon as Sarah repeatedly attempted to roll from her back to her stomach, her face scrunched in concentration. Elizabeth looked up from the moccasins she was crafting from leftover deerskin. "And your stubbornness," she countered with a smile that transformed her face, erasing the wariness that had marked her features when they'd first met. Jedediah watched them both, struck by how seamlessly they had integrated into his life, how the cabin no longer felt like a temporary shelter but a home built on more than timber and nails. The gold that had drawn him to these mountains now seemed incidental compared to the treasure he'd stumbled upon in the snow. The day was clear, the temperature mild enough that Jedediah had suggested they venture outside together. Sarah's first real experience of the world beyond the cabin walls. Bundled securely against the remaining chill, the baby stared wide-eyed at the vastness of sky, at sunlight reflecting off snow, at the breath clouds that formed with each exhalation. "She's never seen so much," Elizabeth marveled, holding Sarah so she could take in the panorama of mountains that surrounded them. "Never felt the sun on her face." Jedediah stood beside them, watchful as always, his rifle slung across his back, a precaution that had become second nature in his years alone, but now carried the weight of protecting more than just himself. "World's a big place," he said, his voice gruff with emotion he couldn't fully express. "Bigger than troubles, bigger than fears." He touched Sarah's cheek gently. "Bigger than the past." Elizabeth leaned slightly against his side, the contact natural, unforced. "Is that why you came here? To find something bigger than what came before?" He considered this, his gaze sweeping across the familiar landscape that had been his sole companion for so long. "Maybe, or maybe just to disappear." He glanced down at her. "Didn't work out that way, though." Her laugh was soft, genuine. "No, it certainly didn't." They walked a short distance from the cabin, following a path Jedediah had cleared to the edge of a small rise that offered views across the valley. The air was crisp, carrying scents of pine and distant water, the first hints that streams would soon begin flowing beneath their frozen surfaces. "When I was a girl," Elizabeth said, adjusting Sarah in her arms, "my father took me fishing each spring, just the two of us, at a creek not far from our home." Her voice carried a wistfulness Jedediah had rarely heard. "He died when I was 12, logging accident." Jedediah nodded, understanding all she didn't say about loss and remembrance. Hard age to lose a father. It changed everything. "Mother took in sewing, I helped where I could, but we lost our home eventually." Her eyes remained on the horizon, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. "That's how I ended up in service to the Rutherfords. No choice but to go where the work was." "Come a long way from there," Jedediah observed. A small smile touched her lips. "In every possible way." She looked up at him then, sunlight illuminating flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Sometimes the longest journeys lead exactly where we need, even when the path seems wrong." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition. A possibility too substantial to ignore. Jedediah's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. Sarah nestled between them like a promise neither had dared to voice. The spell was broken by a sound that didn't belong, distant but unmistakable in the mountain silence. A gunshot. Jedediah stiffened, his posture instantly alert, scanning the valley below and the ridgeline to the south. Elizabeth clutched Sarah closer, her face draining of color. "Could be a hunter," Jedediah said, though he didn't believe it. "Few ventured this far into the mountains, especially not before spring fully established itself." "Or it could be him," Elizabeth whispered, giving voice to the fear that had never fully left her. "Oh, Rutherford. His men, we don't know that." Jedediah's voice was steady, reassuring, though his eyes continued to search for movement against the white landscape. Could be anything. Trapper, prospector, even military survey. But the damage was done. The intrusion of the outside world, however brief, had shattered the sanctuary they'd built during the winter months. Reality had found them, as they'd always known it would. "We should go back," Elizabeth said, already turning toward the cabin, her steps quick but careful on the packed snow. Jedediah followed, his senses heightened, cataloging every sound, every shadow. No further shots came, but the silence that followed seemed pregnant with threat rather than peace. Inside the cabin, Elizabeth's movements took on a frantic quality as she packed Sarah's few belongings into a bundle, her hands trembling slightly. "Well, what are you doing?" Jedediah asked, though he knew the answer. "Preparing." She didn't look up. "If they've found us, we need to be ready to leave. Quickly." He moved to her, gently stilling her hands. "Elizabeth, look at me." She did, her eyes bright with unshed tears, fear etched in the tightness around her mouth. "One shot doesn't mean they've found us," he said firmly. "And even if someone's out there, the passes are still snowed in. No one's getting through without experience and equipment. We're safe for now." "For now," she echoed, the words hollow. "But for how long?" "Spring is coming, Jedediah. The snow is already melting. Bed when the pass is clear, ... Single quotes she trailed off, the rest of the sentence hanging between them. Jedediah's jaw tightened. "When the pass is clear, we'll be ready. I promised you'd be safe, and I mean to keep that promise." "How? One man against Rutherford's resources? Against men paid to make problems disappear?" She shook her head, despair coloring her words. "He won't stop. Not ever. As long as Sarah and I live, we're a liability to him. A scandal waiting to happen. Jedediah took her face in his hand, his touch gentle despite the calloused roughness of his fingers. Listen to me. I fought in a war that taught me the value of one determined man in the right position. This land, these mountains, they're my territory. No hired gun from Denver knows them like I do. She searched his face, wanting to believe. You can't fight an army, Jedediah. Don't need to fight an army. Just need to keep you both beyond their reach. His thumbs wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. And I will, whatever it takes. In that moment, with his hands warm against her skin and his eyes fierce with resolve, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in too long. The luxury of trusting someone else to share her burden. Whatever it takes, she repeated softly. A question and an answer both. Jedediah nodded, sealing an unspoken covenant between them. Then, with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. A first kiss as inevitable as spring following winter, as necessary as breath. When they parted, Sarah cooed from her makeshift cradle, as if approving this new development. The tension dissolved into unexpected laughter, the fear temporarily banished by something stronger, more enduring. Outside, shadows lengthened across the snow as afternoon surrendered to eve. No further shots disturbed the mountain's silence, but the reminder of the world beyond their sanctuary lingered, a cloud on their horizon. That night, as they lay before the fire, Sarah sleeping peacefully between them, Jedediah spoke into the darkness. I've been thinking about what comes next. Elizabeth turned toward him, her face half illuminated by dying embers. And gold's played out here. Been knowing that for months, but didn't want to admit it. His voice was steady, matter of fact, time to move on. Start fresh somewhere. She studied him, understanding all he wasn't saying. Where would we go? The word we hung in the air between them, weighty with implication and possibility. West, Jedediah answered. All the way to the coast, maybe. Oregon territory. Land for the taking, forest for shelter, ocean to put at our backs. Paused. Far from Denver. Far from Rutherford's reach. A long journey, she murmured. Yes, he acknowledged. But not one you'd make alone. Elizabeth's hand found his in the darkness, fingers interlacing. Together, then? Together, he confirmed, the word both simple and profound, a future distilled into 3 syllables. A promise neither had dared hope for when winter had first brought them to each other. Section 8/10. The gunshot proved to be a false alarm, a lone trapper passing through the valley, following the first signs of spring toward better hunting grounds. Jedediah encountered him 3 days later while checking his own traps. A weathered man named Sorensen, who'd been working these mountains almost as long as Jedediah had been alive. Thought I was the only fool still up here, Sorensen remarked, sharing coffee from Jedediah's thermos as they sat on a fallen log, the sun warm on their faces despite the lingering snow. Not anymore, Jedediah replied, careful to reveal nothing about Elizabeth or Sarah. The old trapper studied him with eyes made keen from decades of tracking prey. You seem different, Blackwood, less hollow. Jedediah shrugged, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. Winter changes a man. So does company, Sorensen observed mildly, handing back the thermos. Saw smoke from your cabin. More than usual. Tension gathered in Jedediah's shoulders. Sorensen was harmless, a loner like himself who avoided civilization, except when necessary to trade furs for supplies. But anyone who knew of Elizabeth and Sarah's presence represented a potential threat. Any news from down below? He asked, deflecting. Been isolated since first snow. Sorensen scratched his beard thoughtfully. Not much changes. New saloon in Fort Amity. Railroad surveyors making noise about pushing farther north. He paused. Oh, and there's men asking questions. Offering money for information. Single quotes. Jedediah's blood chilled despite the sunlight. What kind of men? What questions? City types. Well-armed, well-supplied. Looking for a woman and child. Sorensen's gaze sharpened. Said she's deranged, dangerous. Kidnapped a baby belonging to a prominent Denver family. With effort, Jedediah kept his expression neutral. Sounds like trouble best avoided, my thinking exactly. Sorensen rose, adjusting his pack. Funny thing, though. Men that clean, that well-equipped, coming all this way for a mad woman. Doesn't add up. It's all quotes. He spat into the snow. Figured there's another story there. Jedediah stood as well, suddenly eager to return to the cabin to warn Elizabeth, to prepare. Usually is. The old trapper extended a gnarled hand. Been good knowing you, Blackwood. If you're ever through Skagway, ask for Sorensen. First drinks on me. Single, quotes. Jedediah shook his hand, recognizing the farewell for what it was. One solitary man acknowledging another's choice to remain unentangled in the affairs of the outside world. Safe travels, he offered. Sorensen nodded, then hesitated. Whatever you're mixed up in. Hope it's worth it. It is, Jedediah answered without hesitation, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. With a final nod, Sorensen disappeared among the trees, leaving Jedediah alone with knowledge that transformed their tentative plans into urgent necessity. He returned to the cabin at a near run, finding Elizabeth singing softly to Sarah as she bathed her in a metal tub before the fire. The domestic tranquility of the scene, Elizabeth's hair falling loose around her shoulders, Sarah's delighted splashes, the warm scent of pine soap struck him with its precariousness. All this could vanish in an instant. Elizabeth looked up, her smile fading as she registered his expression. What is it? What's happened? Ran into a trapper, Sorensen. Jedediah hung his coat by the door, his movements deliberate despite his racing thoughts. Rutherford's men are in Fort Amity, asking questions, offering rewards. The color drained from Elizabeth's face. How many? Didn't say. He moved to the window, scanning the terrain out of habit, but they're spreading lies. Saying you're deranged, that you kidnapped Sarah from her rightful family. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she lifted Sarah from the bath, wrapping her in a towel. He's setting the stage, creating a narrative where he's the victim, not the villain. Her voice hardened, making sure no one would believe me if I ever told the truth. Jedediah turned from the window. We need to move our timeline up. Can't wait for summer to head west. The passes will start clearing in 3, maybe 4 weeks. He ran a hand through his beard, mind racing. We can be ready by then. I've been stockpiling supplies, preserving meat. We have enough to get to the coast if we're careful. Elizabeth settled Sarah on her lap, drying her gently. And if they come before the pass is clear? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. Jedediah moved to the corner where his rifle stood, checking it with practiced hands. Then we defend what's ours, he said simply. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation and vigilance. Jedediah reinforced the cabin's defenses, adding a bar to the door, constructing crude shutters for the windows, clearing sight lines in all directions. Elizabeth sewed frantically, creating warm traveling clothes for herself and Sarah from every scrap of fabric they could spare. At night, after Sarah slept, they pored over Jedediah's crude map of the territories, plotting a route west that would keep them away from settlements where Rutherford's influence might reach. They spoke in low voices of the future they would build, of the home they would make by the ocean, of the life Sarah would have far from the shadow of her biological father. She needed a name, Elizabeth said one evening as they traced the path they would take. A family name. Caldwell is too easily traced. Jedediah looked up from the map, the question in his eyes unspoken but clear. Blackwood, Elizabeth continued softly. Sarah Blackwood, if that's something you might want. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire and Sarah's soft breathing from her cradle. Jedediah's throat worked, emotion rendering him momentarily speechless. I'd be honored, he managed finally, his voice rough, but it should be official, proper. Elizabeth smiled, understanding his meaning. Yes, it should. The next day, as a pale sun climbed above the eastern ridges, Jedediah and Elizabeth stood before the cabin, Sarah bundled warmly in her mother's arms. They had no witness but the mountains, no officiant but their own conviction, no ceremony beyond the simple words they had chosen. I take you, Elizabeth Caldwell, as my wife, Jedediah spoke, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, to protect and provide for, to respect and cherish, until death parts us. Elizabeth's eyes shone with tears that didn't fall. I take you, Jedediah Blackwood, as my husband, to stand beside in all seasons, to face each dawn and dusk with, to build a life worthy of the love that brought us together. They exchanged no rings, had none to give, but sealed their vows with a kiss that carried all the promise of their uncertain future. Sarah, sensing the importance of the moment, remained solemnly quiet in her mother's embrace. Simple ceremony for simple folk, Jedediah said afterward, a rare smile transforming his weathered face. Elizabeth touched his cheek gently. The truest vows need no witnesses. That night, for the first time, Sarah slept in her cradle while Jedediah and Elizabeth claimed the full measure of their marriage, their bodies discovering each other with the wonder of explorers mapping uncharted territory. In the aftermath, lying tangled in blankets before the dying fire, Elizabeth traced the scars that mapped Jedediah's chest, old wounds from war, from mining, from survival. We're quite a pair, she murmured. Both broken, both mended. Jedediah caught her hand, pressing it against his heart. Not broken, just tested. She smiled at the distinction. Then we've passed our tests. Some of them, he amended, ever practical. Hardest ones still coming. The reminder of their precarious situation couldn't dampen the contentment of the moment, but it lingered at the edges of their consciousness. The knowledge that this sanctuary was temporary. That danger approached with the spring thaw. As March gave way to April, the transformation of the landscape accelerated. Snow retreated from south-facing slopes, exposing patches of earth still dormant but stirring with potential life. The creek that had been silent all winter began to murmur beneath thinning ice, and the first returning birds announced themselves with tentative songs at dawn. Jedediah ventured farther each day, monitoring the conditions of the passes, catching supplies along their planned escape route, and watching for signs of intrusion into their territory. Elizabeth prepared for the journey with equal diligence, rendering fat for pemmican, drying the last of their meat, fashioning a carrier that would allow her to keep Sarah secure against her chest while traveling. Sarah, oblivious to the preparations that revolved around her safety, continued her miraculous developments, attempting to crawl, babbling consonants that might someday form words, laughing with a joy that seemed to transcend the circumstances of her creation. She has your eyes, Elizabeth observed one evening as Jedediah held the baby, his large hands dwarfing her small form. Not the color, but the shape. The way they crinkle when you smile. He looked up, surprised. Never noticed. I have. She touched his arm gently. It's as if she was meant to be yours all along. The sentiment struck him deeply. This idea that family could be formed not just through blood, but through choice, through love, through the deliberate claiming of responsibility for another's well-being. On the 12th of April, As a light rain fell for the first time that year, washing winter's last remnants from the newly exposed earth, Jedediah returned from his scouting with news that changed everything. "South Pass is clearing," he announced, shedding his wet coat. "Another week, maybe less, and we can make it through." Elizabeth looked up from where she sat mending, relief and apprehension mingling in her expression. "And no sign of ... Jedediah shook his head. "Nothing yet." But he hesitated, uncertain whether to share the rest. "But what?" she pressed, recognizing his reluctance. He sighed. "Saw smoke, West Ridge. Could be another trapper hunter. Could be nothing." Elizabeth's hands stilled. "Or it could be them." "Could be," he acknowledged. "Which means we go tomorrow, ready or not." "First light." She nodded, no argument forthcoming. They had known this moment would come, had prepared for it with all the thoroughness their limited resources allowed. "I'll finish packing tonight," she said, her voice steady despite the fear he knew she must feel. "We'll be ready." Jedediah crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. "One more day," he promised. "Then we leave this all behind. Start fresh." Elizabeth leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "Not all of it," she whispered. "Some things are worth carrying forward." Outside, the rain continued to fall, gentle but persistent, transforming the world inch by inch revealing what had been hidden, preparing the earth for new growth, washing away the traces of all that had come before. Section 9/10 dawn arrived with reluctance, the sun struggling to pierce a blanket of low clouds that had settled over the mountains during the night. Jedediah woke before the first hint of light, moving through the cabin with practiced silence, gathering the last of their supplies into carefully prepared packs. Elizabeth joined him moments later, Sarah still sleeping against her shoulder, unwilling to disturb the baby's rest until the last possible moment. They worked methodically, few words passing between them, a partnership forged through months of shared existence, each anticipating the other's movements in the confined space. Their preparations had been thorough, leaving little to be done beyond final decisions on what must be left behind. Jedediah paused before his small shelf of book-sworn volumes that had been his only company through long winters. His fingers brushed their spines with unexpected sentimentality. "We can make room," Elizabeth offered, noting his hesitation. He shook his head. Weight matters more than memories now. He selected only one, a collection of poetry that had been his mother's, and tucked it into his pack. The rest would remain, along with the crude furniture, the mended cookware, the trappings of a life being deliberately abandoned. As gray light finally seeped through the windows, they shared a last meal in the cabin that had sheltered them through winter's fury: salted venison, hardtack, strong coffee. Sarah woke, fussing briefly before settling into the rhythm of nursing, her eyes drifting from Jedediah to her mother with calm acceptance of their tense vigilance. "She knows something's different," Elizabeth murmured, stroking the baby's downy head. Jedediah nodded, his gaze moving constantly between the door and the window. "Smart, like her mother. Watchful, like her father," Elizabeth countered softly, using the word deliberately, claiming the bond that had formed between the miner and the child he discovered in the snow. When the time came to depart, they stood for one final moment in the center of the cabin, absorbing its simple shelter, its humble comforts, its unexpected role as the birthplace of their family. "Never thought I'd be sad to leave this place," Jedediah admitted, his voice rough with emotion he rarely expressed. Elizabeth touched his arm gently. "It's not the place we'll miss." He covered her hand with his own, understanding. It wasn't the cabin itself, but what had happened within its walls, the transformation from strangers to family, from isolation to connection, from people running from the past to those moving purposefully toward a future. With Sarah secured in the carrier against Elizabeth's chest, protected from the elements by layers of wool and fur, they stepped outside into the damp morning. The world was shrouded in mist, visibility limited to a few hundred yards in any direction. Jedediah assessed the conditions with a miner's practicality. "Weather's in our favor," he observed. "Harder to track us, harder to see us coming." Elizabeth adjusted the straps of her pack, distributing the weight evenly across her shoulders. "How long did the pass?" 6 hours at a steady pace. "Less if we push." He checked his rifle one last time before slinging it across his back. "Trails marked with cairns where I've cached supplies. First one's about 2 miles out." With a final glance at the cabin, they set off, following a narrow path that led northwest toward the lowest point in the ridgeline that had defined their horizon for months. The ground was treacherous, partially thawed, giving way unexpectedly beneath their boots, requiring constant attention to footing. Sarah remained mercifully quiet, lulled by the steady motion of her mother's gait. They moved in silence save for the sound of their breathing, the crunch of boots on remaining snow, the occasional murmur of reassurance to Sarah. Jedediah led, constantly scanning their surroundings, alert for any sign that their departure had been observed. Elizabeth followed closely, her steps determined despite the added weight of child and pack. The first miles passed without incident, the fog gradually thinning as they gained elevation, revealing glimpses of the valley falling away behind them. At the first cairn, a careful stack of stones marking a hollow beneath a lightning-split pine, Jedediah retrieved a small bundle of smoked fish and additional ammunition, redistributing both between their packs. "Making good time," he noted, offering Elizabeth's water from his canteen. "Pass should be visible once we clear that ridge." He pointed to a rocky outcropping perhaps a mile distant. Elizabeth drank gratefully, adjusting Sarah, who had begun to stir. "Any sign of pursuit?" And Jedediah shook his head. "Nothing yet. But that's smoke I saw yesterday. We're not alone in these mountains. They continued onward, the trail steepening as they approached the ridge. Elizabeth's breathing grew more labored, though she made no complaint. Jedediah slowed his pace slightly, recognizing her struggle despite her determination to match his stride. We'll rest at the top, he promised, gesturing toward the outcropping ahead. Get a clear view of what we're facing. The climb to the ridge was arduous, loose rock giving way beneath their feet. Patches of ice still cling into shadowed recesses, the air thinning noticeably with each 100 feet of elevation gain. By the time they reached the summit, both were breathing heavily, sweat dampening their clothing despite the cool air. The view that greeted them was both magnificent and sobering. To the west lay their route forward, a steep descent into a narrow valley, then up again to the pass that would lead them toward the distant coast. The path was clear of major snow obstacles, as Jedediah had predicted, though patches of white still clung to north-facing slopes. But it was the view behind them that seized their attention. Smoke rose from a point perhaps 3 miles back, not from the direction of their cabin, but from the trail they had just traversed. Someone had made camp there recently enough that their fire still burned. Could be anyone, Elizabeth said, though her tone belied the hope in her words. Jedediah's expression hardened. Maybe, but we don't risk finding out. He studied the terrain ahead, making quick calculations. We push for the pass now. No more stops unless absolutely necessary. The descent from the ridge was faster but more treacherous than the climb had been. Loose shales slipped beneath their boots, sending small avalanches of stone clattering down the slope. Sarah began to fuss, disturbed by the jerking motion and increasing tension. Elizabeth murmured soothing words, one hand protectively cradling the baby's head while the other sought stable handholds. They were halfway down when the sound reached them, distant but unmistakable. A gunshot. Jedediah froze, then pulled Elizabeth into the shelter of a rocky overhang, eyes scanning the ridge they had just descended. No figures appeared against the skyline, but the message was clear. They were being followed, and their pursuers wanted them to know it. Warning shot, he said grimly. They're tracking us. Elizabeth's face paled, her arms tightening around Sarah, who had begun to cry in earnest, sensing her mother's fear. How many? Can't tell. At least 2, maybe more. Jedediah checked his rifle, jaw set in determination. We keep moving, fast as we can. Valley floor gives better cover. They abandoned caution for speed, half running, half sliding down the remaining slope, sending cascades of rock and dirt before them. Sarah's cries echoed against the mountain walls, but they could spare no time for comfort beyond Elizabeth's breathless assurances. The valley floor offered temporary relief, scattered pines providing concealment, a small stream cutting through the center, creating natural obstacles for pursuit. They crossed the icy water at its shallowest point, the cold biting through their boots, then plunged into the tree line on the opposite bank. Keep going, Jedediah urged as Elizabeth stumbled, fatigue beginning to show in her movements. Passes just beyond that rise. She nodded, summoning reserves of strength born from maternal determination. I can make it. We can make it. They had covered perhaps half the distance across the valley when another shot rang out closer this time, the bullet splintering bark from a tree just yards to their left. No warning now. Their pursuers were shooting to kill. Jedediah pulled Elizabeth behind a massive fallen trunk, unslung his rifle, and scanned the terrain they had just crossed. Movement caught his eye. 2 figures emerging from the tree line near the stream, a third remaining on the opposite bank. Men in dark coats carrying rifles, moving with the confidence of those accustomed to hunting human prey. Rutherford's men, Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible above Sarah's frightened cries. Fletcher must have survived, told them where to find us. Jedediah's expression hardened into something Elizabeth had never seen before. The look of a soldier returned to a battlefield he had never truly left. 3 that I can see, maybe more hanging back. What do we do? The question was simple, the answer anything but. Jedediah assessed their options with cold calculation. The pass lay less than a mile ahead, but across open terrain with minimal cover. Their pursuers were closing the distance rapidly, using the trees for concealment while maintaining clear sight lines to track their quarry. I'll draw them off, he decided, checking his ammunition. Circle back, flank them. You take Sarah and head for the pass. There's a cache just beyond the entrance, enough supplies to get you to the next settlement. No. Elizabeth's refusal was immediate, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. We stay together. Live or die, we face it as a family. The word echoed between them, carrying all the weight of their shared months, their exchanged vows, their common purpose centered on the child now whimpering against Elizabeth's chest. Family. Jedediah's resolve wavered, then strengthened into something more complex. All right, he conceded. Together. But we need a different approach. He surveyed their surroundings, mind racing through scenarios, through battlefield tactics adapted to this mountainous terrain. Then his gaze settled on the pass itself, narrow, flanked by steep rock faces, the perfect location for an ambush if they could reach it first. We make for the pass, he decided. Full speed. Use the trees for cover as long as possible, then the rock formations near the entrance. If we can get there before them, we control the high ground. Elizabeth nodded, adjusting Sarah's carrier to ensure the baby was secure. And if we can't, Jedediah met her eyes, no false comfort in his gaze. Then we fight. For her, for us, for everything. Another shot cracked through the valley, closer still. Their pursuers were gaining ground, confident in their superior numbers, in the inevitability of their task. Ready? Jedediah asked, his hand finding Elizabeth's for one brief, powerful squeeze. She nodded, her fear transmuted into resolute determination. Ready. Together they rose from behind the fallen trunk and ran toward the pass, toward a future that hung in the balance between hope and bullet, between the family they had formed and the forces that sought to tear it apart. Section 10 tense, they ran as they had never run before, Elizabeth's breath coming in sharp gasps. Jedediah slightly ahead, creating a path of least resistance through the undergrowth. Sarah's cries had subsided to whimpers, the baby somehow sensing the need for quiet in this desperate flight. The terrain sloped upward as they approached the pass, each step requiring greater effort, each moment exposing them more fully to the men who pursued them with single-minded determination. Bullets sang through the air, some finding homes in tree trunks, others kicking up dirt at their heels. Their pursuers were no longer concealing their intentions. This was not capture but execution. Almost there, Jedediah called back, his voice tight with exertion. "See those boulders? That's our position." The pass entrance loomed before them, a natural corridor between towering rock faces, the floor still partially covered with melting snow. Just before the entrance, a tumble of massive boulders created a defensive position that might, with luck and skill, allow them to hold off superior numbers. They reached the rocks mere moments before another volley of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Jedediah pulled Elizabeth down behind the largest boulder, shielding both her and Sarah with his body as bullets ricocheted off stone. "Stay low," he instructed, maneuvering to the edge of their shelter to assess their situation. Their pursuers had halted at the valley's edge, temporarily stymied by the exposed ground that separated them from the pass. 3 men, as Jedediah had counted earlier, spread out among the trees. A 4th figure now emerged from the shadows, taller than the other, better dressed, his bearing suggesting authority rather than mere employment. "That's Fletcher," Elizabeth whispered, peering cautiously around Jedediah's shoulder. Rutherford's right hand, single quotes. Jedediah's jaw tightened. The man who had tried to murder Elizabeth and Sarah in the wilderness, who had tracked them across mountains with cold persistence, who now stood between them and freedom. "Mrs. Caldwell." Fletcher's voice carried across the open ground, cultivated and controlled despite the circumstances. "This pursuit is unnecessary. Mr. Rutherford merely wishes to ensure his child's welfare." Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. His child's welfare? He wanted her dead. "A misunderstanding," Fletcher called back. "One that can be rectified through civilized negotiation. Come down and we can discuss terms that benefit all parties." Jedediah glanced at Elizabeth, whose expression had hardened into something beyond fear. "He's lying," she said flatly. "If we surrender, we're dead before nightfall." "I know," Jedediah confirmed. He checked his rifle again, calculating ammunition against adversaries. 6 shots before I need to reload. 4 men. Not ideal odds. "What's your play, Blackwood?" Fletcher shouted, impatience coloring his tone. "You've nowhere to go. The pass leads to nothing but more wilderness. You'll never make it to settlement with a woman and infant in tow." Jedediah turned to Elizabeth, their faces close in the confined space behind the boulder. "He's wrong about that. We'd make it." His voice lowered. "But first we have to get through them." She nodded, no trace of doubt in her expression. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep Sarah safe. Stay behind cover." He hesitated, then added, "If something happens to me, the cache is 50 yards into the pass, beneath a rock marked with 3 notches. Everything you need to reach the settlement is there." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "Don't talk like that. We go together or not at all." Jedediah touched her face gently, memorizing its contour. "Just a precaution." From below, Fletcher's patience had clearly run out. "Final warning," he called. "Surrender the woman and child and you can walk away, Minor. This isn't your fight. That's where you're wrong," Jedediah muttered, positioning himself at the edge of the boulder. He took careful aim at the nearest of Fletcher's men, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed against the mountainside as the man dropped, Jedediah's bullet finding its mark with deadly precision. Before the others could react, he had fired again, forcing them to scatter for cover. "You've made your choice," Fletcher shouted, rage replacing his earlier composure. "Kill them all," he ordered his remaining men. What followed was a deadly exchange of gunfire, bullets pinging off rocks and whining through the air around their shelter. Jedediah maintained his position, firing only when certain of his target, making each bullet count. 1 more of Fletcher's men fell, clutching his chest, while the 3rd was wounded but still capable of returning fire. Then, as Jedediah paused to reload, disaster struck. Elizabeth, shifting to better protect Sarah, dislodged a smaller rock that clattered down the slope, momentarily exposing their position. The wounded gunman fired immediately, his bullet grazing Jedediah's temple, sending him reeling backward. Elizabeth's scream pierced the gunfire as he collapsed beside her, blood streaming from the wound. He remained conscious but dazed, struggling to focus as warm blood clouded his vision. The rifle had fallen from his grasp, landing just beyond their protective shelter. Fletcher, sensing advantage, began moving upslope toward his remaining man, providing covering fire. "It's over, Mrs. Caldwell," he called, confidence restored. "A shame about your Minor. Fought well for a commoner." Elizabeth looked from Jedediah's wounded form to the approaching men, desperation and determination warring in her expression. With quick movements, she unwrapped Sarah from her carrier and placed the baby in the most protected hollow of their rocky shelter. "Elizabeth," Jedediah mumbled, struggling to sit upright. Don't, ... single quotes. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, then to Sarah's. I love you both, she whispered. Then, before Jedediah could stop her, she had snatched up his fallen rifle and moved to the opposite edge of their shelter. The next moments unfolded in a blur of sound and motion. Elizabeth fired, her shot catching Fletcher's companion in the shoulder, spinning him backward down the slope. Fletcher himself dove for cover, returning fire with cold precision. Jedediah, fighting through his injury, dragged himself to Elizabeth's side, reaching for the rifle. Give me the gun, he urged. Please. She turned to him, determination blazing in her eyes. We protect what's ours, she said, echoing his words from months before. Whatever it takes. Before he could respond, a new sound cut through the exchange of gunfire, the distinctive crack of ice giving way. They looked up to see a massive shelf of snow and ice, loosened by the vibrations of gunfire, breaking free from the rock face above the pass. Avalanche, Jedediah shouted, lunging for Sarah as the first wave of snow cascaded down. Elizabeth dropped the rifle, diving back toward their shelter as the world dissolved into thunderous white. They huddled together, Jedediah's arms encircling both Elizabeth and Sarah, their bodies pressed into the meager protection of the boulder's lee as snow and ice roared past them, obliterating the landscape. The slide lasted only seconds but transformed everything in its path. When the rumbling finally ceased, they emerged cautiously from their shelter to find the pass entrance entirely altered, snow packed densely along its length, the path to the valley floor buried beneath tons of displaced ice. Of Fletcher and his wounded companion there was no sign. The avalanche had swept them away as thoroughly as a hand clearing pieces from a game board. Are they? Elizabeth began, clutching Sarah, who had miraculously remained silent throughout the cataclysm. Gone, Jedediah confirmed, scanning the altered terrain below, either buried or driven back. He winced, pressing a hand to his bloodied temple. Won't be following us through that in any case. The path forward remained clear, the pass itself swept clean by the slide's momentum, revealing bare rock and earth beyond their position. The cache Jedediah had prepared still waited, untouched by nature's intervention. We need to move, Elizabeth said, practical even in the aftermath of their deliverance. Before your wound gets worse, before more come, Jedediah nodded, though the movement sent fresh pain lancing through his skull. Help me up. Together, supporting each other's weight, they retrieved the supplies from the cache and began the journey through the pass, slow but steady, each step carrying them further from danger, closer to the future they had fought to claim. By nightfall, they had put 5 miles between themselves and the site of the confrontation. The pass had widened into a sheltered valley, a stream running clear and cold along its center, offering both water and the pleasant sound of life continuing its cycle despite human conflict. They made camp beneath a stand of pines, a small fire warding off the chill that descended with darkness. Jedediah's wound, cleaned and bandaged with supplies from the cache, had proven less severe than it had first appeared, a deep graze rather than a penetrating injury. Sarah slept peacefully between them, exhausted by the day's trauma but resilient as only the very young can be. Elizabeth traced her daughter's features with a gentle finger, marveling at the miracle of her survival, not just today but from the beginning. She was always meant to live, she murmured, despite everything arranged against her. Jedediah watched them both, his expression softened by more than just fatigue. Some things are stronger than the forces aligned against them, he said. Love, family, the will to build something worth defending. Elizabeth looked up, meeting his gaze across the firelight. Is that what we are? Something worth defending? Worth dying for, he corrected gently, though I'm glad it didn't come to that. They sat in companionable silence as stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting in the snow, their growth from strangers to family, their transformation from isolated survivors to people with a shared purpose. What happens now? Elizabeth asked finally. Fletcher is gone, but Rutherford remains. His reach is long, not as long as the distance will put between him and us, Jedediah replied. The Oregon coast is still the plan. Land, a home, a life where Sarah grows up never knowing fear or want. A life where she knows she's cherished, Elizabeth added, by both her parents. The words settled between them, no longer tentative or aspirational, but a simple statement of truth. Jedediah reached across the space that separated them, his hand finding Elizabeth's with the certainty of long practice. I found gold after all, he said softly, his gaze encompassing both her and the sleeping child. Not the kind I came looking for, but the only kind that matters. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around his. We found each other, all of us. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow bearing witness to this small family forged in winter's grip, tested by fire, and now moving forward into spring's promise, carrying with them the certainty that even in the harshest wilderness, life finds a way to not merely survive, but to flourish. And as the fire burned low, casting golden light across their faces, the lonely miner who had once sought fortune in cold stone treasured instead the warmth of the woman and child who had given him, at last, a reason to truly live.